Lily sat on the edge of her small bed, the worn mattress sagging beneath her weight, her fingers idly tracing the delicate embroidery on the quilt she had sewn years ago. The room was dim, the single lamp casting a tired glow on the peeling wallpaper, a silent witness to the years she had spent here, stitching, mending, making something whole even as the world around her remained broken. Outside, the sound of cicadas hummed beneath the distant murmur of a segregated town settling into the quiet of another southern evening. The doctor's words still clung to the air like the scent of rain before a storm. Final stage. No more than a few months. She had swallowed the news without tears, without protest, nodding as if it were just another burden she had always expected to carry. She had lived her life in service. To her students, to the children who looked at her with wide, questioning eyes, as she taught them to read in the worn-down one-room schoolhouse, to the mothers who pressed their hands into hers after class and whispered thanks because their babies would have the chance they never did. But now, Lily had nothing left to give, except the time she had left, and she would not let it slip away like sand through cracked fingers. The town of Rosewood was a place where history stained the streets, like blood that had never fully dried. The Whites' only sign still swung lazily outside the diner where she wasn't allowed to sit, where she had once stood outside in the heat, waiting for the cook to pass her food through the side door like she was something less than human. The bus ride home was always a quiet indignity, standing at the back, gripping the rail when her feet ached, while empty seats sat unoccupied at the front. She had spent a lifetime swallowing her anger, pushing it down with every spoonful of cornbread, every sip of sweet tea, until it settled deep inside her, an ache heavier than any illness. But no more. Not now. There were things left undone, words left unsaid, and Lily refused to let the world shrink her into nothing before she was ready to go. She had never left Rosewood, never seen the world beyond the fields of cotton and the cracked sidewalks of its main street, but there was one place she had dreamed of: New Orleans. A city alive with music, where people of her kind walked without stepping aside, where she could hear the blues sung in voices that knew her pain, where she could sit at a cafe table and drink a cup of coffee without fear of being dragged away. But dreams were dangerous things for a woman like her, especially one running out of time. The money she had saved was meant for something else. She had always told herself that. Meant for a rainy day, for emergencies. But wasn't this an emergency? Wasn't this the last storm she would ever have to face? She felt the weight of the envelope in her hands, the crispness of the bill she had folded away over the years. Not much, but enough. Enough to get her on a train. Enough to breathe in the air of a world that had always been kept just out of reach. But first, there was someone she had to see. The house stood on the other side of town, where the streets were paved smoother, where the windows shone with the polish of careful hands. Lily had not knocked on this door in over 10 years. She had walked past it many times, always stealing a glance at the lace curtains in the window, wondering if they ever moved, if there was ever a moment when the woman inside thought of her. When the door swung open, the air between them was thick with everything they had never said. Ruth looked smaller than Lily remembered, her once perfect hair streaked with gray, her eyes widening in something like fear, like disbelief. "Lily," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. I didn't think you'd ever come." Lily studied her sister's face. The sharp angles softened with age, the years etching sorrow into the lines around her mouth. "I don't have much time," Lily said simply, and the truth of it settled between them like dust in an old room. Ruth stepped aside. "Come in." The house smelled of lemon polish and regret. The air was thick with the scent of memories, of Sundays long past when they had been girls playing in the yard, before Ruth had chosen a different path, before she had married a white man and left Lily behind, before she had stopped saying her name in public as if their shared blood was something to be ashamed of. But Lily did not come for apologies. She did not come for guilt. She came for something she couldn't name, something she needed before she was gone. They sat in silence, the years stretched between them like an ocean neither of them could cross. And then, softly, Ruth spoke. "I have a son." she said, her voice trembling. His name is Samuel. He's 13 now. He doesn't know about you. Lily closed her eyes. A nephew. A boy who shared her blood, who had grown up without knowing his aunt's name, without knowing the woman who had once held his mother's hand when she was just a girl. The hurt curled in Lily's chest, but she only nodded. I'd like to meet him. Ruth hesitated, and Lily saw the war in her eyes, the fear of what it might mean, of what it might cost. But then she nodded. I'll bring him to you. It was not forgiveness. It was not enough. But it was something. And for now, that was all Lily needed. Lily sat in Ruth's pristine living room, the silence stretching between them like an unspoken apology neither of them knew how to give. The scent of lemon polish clung to the air, mingling with the faint trace of Ruth's perfume, a smell Lily remembered from childhood, when they had been just two little girls sharing the same bed, whispering secrets beneath threadbare blankets. But time had turned them into strangers, and now they sat across from each other like two women waiting for a verdict neither of them had the strength to deliver. Lily's fingers ran absent-mindedly over the armrest of the stiff floral couch, her mind drifting back to the days when Ruth had been her shadow, her best friend, her protector. But that was before the world had divided them, before Ruth had chosen a life Lily was never meant to be a part of, before the weight of skin color and shame had pulled them in opposite directions. And now here they were, older, heavier with regrets, and Lily with a clock inside her body ticking down the days she had left. The thought made her stomach twist. How many of those days did she have now? How many more sunrises before she wouldn't be able to see them? Ruth stood abruptly, smoothing her hands over the front of her dress, her breath uneven. I should go get Samuel. The name alone sent a ripple through Lily's chest, a nephew she had never met, a boy who had no idea she existed. She wondered what he looked like, if he had their father's deep-set eyes, their mother's wide smile, if there was any trace of her in his face at all. The idea of seeing him was terrifying. Would he even want to know her? Would he see her the way Ruth once had, as something to be ashamed of? She didn't have time for that. She couldn't afford to waste whatever time was left. All right, Lily said, her voice softer than she intended. Ruth gave a hesitant nod and disappeared down the hall, leaving Lily alone with her thoughts. The walls were lined with photographs, black and white portraits of Ruth's husband, a tall white man with an authoritative gaze, pictures of Samuel as a baby, a toddler, a boy in a school uniform standing in front of a brick building. He had Ruth's eyes. The realization sent a sharp ache through Lily's ribs. This was the life Ruth had built, the family she had made, the world she had chosen over the one they had been born into. And Lily had never been a part of it. A creak of the floorboards made her look up. A boy stood in the doorway, gangly with long limbs that still held traces of childhood. His hair was neatly combed, his collared shirt pressed, his wide brown eyes filled with cautious curiosity as he studied her. Lily's throat tightened. Samuel? The boy nodded but said nothing, his gaze flicking to his mother, who stood behind him with her hands clasped in front of her like she was waiting for something to break. This is your Aunt Lily, Ruth said, her voice careful, measured. Samuel looked at her, and for a moment, Lily felt laid bare under his gaze, like he was trying to piece together why this woman had never been in his life before. Then, slowly, he took a step forward. Mama says you used to be a teacher, he said, his voice clear, steady. Lily managed a small smile. I still am. But you're sick now, he said, not as a question but as a statement, one he seemed to understand in a way that made Lily's heart twist. Yes, she admitted, because there was no point in lying. Samuel tilted his head, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. Are you gonna die? Ruth sucked in a breath, but Lily didn't flinch. Children had a way of cutting through pleasantries, through the words adults dressed up to make things less painful. Yes, she said simply. Not today. But soon. Samuel's brow furrowed, and Lily wondered if he had ever had to think about death before, if it had ever reached into his perfect little world before now. Then, After a moment, he moved to sit in the chair across from her, his small hands resting on his knees. "Does it hurt?" Lily considered the question. Pain was there, always, a dull ache in her bones, a heaviness in her chest that some days made it hard to breathe. But there were other kinds of pain too, the one she had carried long before the sickness had taken root inside her. "Some days," she admitted, "but not today." Samuel was quiet for a long time, his young mind working through something Lily couldn't quite decipher. Then he said, "Mama says you like music." Lily blinked, caught off guard. "I do." "Me too." The smile that spread across his face was small but real, and for the first time since she had arrived, Lily felt something settle inside her, something that had been untethered for years. She nodded toward the piano sitting in the corner of the room, its keys covered neatly with a dustless cloth. "You play?" Samuel's face lit up. "I'm learning." "Show me," she said, and just like that, the distance between them closed. He scrambled up, pulling the cloth away and settling onto the bench, his fingers pressing hesitantly against the keys. A simple melody filled the space between them, soft and tentative, and Lily closed her eyes, letting herself feel the warmth of the moment. For the first time in a long time, she felt something other than the weight of dying. She felt something like belonging. Ruth stood near the doorway, watching, her lips pressed together, her eyes filled with something Lily couldn't name. Regret? Relief? It didn't matter. Not now. There was still time. Not much. But enough. Lily sat back in the chair, her eyes closed as the sound of the piano filled the room, each note trembling but determined, much like the boy playing it. Samuel's fingers stumbled here and there, but the melody was unmistakable, something soft and filled with yearning. She recognized it instantly, an old spiritual their mother used to hum when the nights were restless, when the weight of the world had pressed too heavily on their shoulders. Lily hadn't heard it in years, but here it was, brought back to life by the hands of a child she had never met before today, a child who was somehow part of her, whether Ruth wanted to admit it or not. When he finished, Samuel turned to her, his eyes searching her face for approval. "That was beautiful," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mama taught me," he admitted, glancing at Ruth, who stood stiffly by the doorway, hands still clasped in front of her, as though unsure whether she should stay or leave. "She said Grandma used to sing it." Lily swallowed past the lump in her throat. "She did," she murmured. "She used to sing it when she wanted to remind us that no matter how heavy the world got, we'd always have a home in the music." Samuel nodded as though he understood, and maybe he did, maybe somewhere inside him. He carried that same weight, even if he had never known the full depth of it. He turned back to the piano, running his fingers along the keys absent-mindedly. "Will you be here tomorrow?" Lily's chest tightened. She wished she could say yes. She wished she could promise him time, a future where they could sit side by side at the piano, where she could teach him the songs their mother used to sing, tell him the stories she had never been able to tell Ruth. But she had made too many promises in her life that she couldn't keep, and she refused to make another one now. Instead, she gave him the truth. "I don't know," she said gently. Samuel frowned, but he didn't argue. He was young, but he was smart. He understood more than most. After a moment, he climbed down from the bench and moved to sit beside her on the couch, his small hands folding in his lap. "Mama says people go to heaven when they die," he said after a while. "Do you believe that?" Lily thought about it. She had spent so much of her life worrying about the here and now, about surviving, about making it through the next day, the next week, the next month, that she had never given much thought to what came after. "I'd like to believe that," she admitted. Samuel looked thoughtful. "I think heaven has a big piano," he said finally. "Bigger than this one. And everybody gets to play, even the ones who weren't allowed before." Lily felt something crack open inside her, something fragile and aching, and she had to look away before the tears in her eyes could betray her. "I hope you're right," she whispered. He reached for her hand then, his fingers warm and small against hers, and for the first time in a long time, Lily felt like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone. Ruth cleared her throat, and they both looked up. "It's getting late," she said, her voice softer than before. "Samuel, why don't you go wash up for dinner?" Samuel hesitated, glancing at Lily, as though he was afraid she might disappear the moment he left the room. "Go on," she said, squeezing his hand gently. "I'll be here when you get back." He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded and slipped off the couch, disappearing down the hall. Ruth lingered in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said quietly. Lily arched an eyebrow. "For what?" Ruth shifted on her feet, looking down at her hands. "For being kind to him," she said finally. "For not making him feel like he has to choose between us." Lily let out a soft breath, exhaustion pressing against her bones. "He shouldn't have to choose," she said. "That's not on him. That's on us." Ruth nodded, her gaze heavy with something unspoken. For a long moment, neither of them said anything, the silence stretching between them like a bridge neither of them knew how to cross. Then Ruth glanced toward the hallway where Samuel had disappeared and let out a shaky breath. "Would you like to stay for dinner?" The question caught Lily off guard, not because she hadn't expected it, but because it was the first olive branch Ruth had extended in years. And maybe, just maybe, it was the only one she was ever going to get. "I'd like that," Lily said. Ruth gave a small nod, then turned and disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Lily alone once more. She sat there for a moment, listening to the distant clatter of dishes, the hum of something sizzling on the stove, the quiet murmur of Samuel talking to himself in the bathroom. It was such a simple, ordinary moment, but to Lily, it felt like something more. It felt like something she had been chasing her whole life. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she had finally found it. Lily sat there in the quiet of Ruth's kitchen as the soft clatter of utensils and the gentle simmer of a pot on the stove provided a fragile soundtrack to the evening, her mind swirling with thoughts of days gone by and a future that was slipping through her grasp like so much fine sand. Her body ached with a deep, unyielding pain that was both physical and emotional, a reminder of the terminal illness that now shadowed every step, every breath. Yet she could not allow the burden of despair to crush the spark of defiance that had carried her through a lifetime of racial cruelty and personal rejection, and so she listened to the murmurs of conversation from the next room where Samuel's quiet laughter mingled with soft words from his mother, his innocent voice weaving through the air with the promise of renewal that Lily had long thought lost, the memory of the piano, the melody that had filled the room earlier with the ghost of her childhood, and the hope of tomorrow, echoed in her heart as she recalled the way Samuel's small fingers had danced on the keys and how his eyes, bright with unspoken wonder, had silently pleaded for a world where he could belong without the weight of prejudice, and it stirred in her a determination to fight for that very future, even if it meant defying the segregated, bitter realities of the South that had so long tried to confine her spirit. As Ruth reappeared from the kitchen, her face softening with tentative warmth and apologies unspoken, yet understood, Lily felt the tenuous threads of family and love begin to weave a tapestry that might, against all odds, heal old wounds and bridge the chasm of years filled with estrangement and regret. And in that moment she resolved that she would not let the cruel hand of fate rob her of her dignity or silence her voice. She would sing her truth to the world, defiant and tender, in a final act of rebellion against a society that had told her she was too much, that she should hide behind seams and stitched-up dresses. And as the night deepened and the shadows of the past merged with the flickering light of a single overhead bulb, Lily slowly rose from the table, her resolve hardening like tempered steel, and she made her way to the small, battered mirror that hung crookedly on the wall, her reflection a mosaic of sorrow, strength, and undying beauty. And in that fractured image she saw not a dying woman burdened by illness and discrimination, but a warrior who had carried the legacy of her ancestors in every breath and every heartbeat, a woman who had loved fiercely despite the odds, and who, with a trembling hand, opened a drawer to retrieve a worn journal, her private confidant, filled with poems and memories, with dreams once deferred and secrets never spoken, and as she began to write, her words spilling onto the yellowed pages like tears of both grief and hope, she resolved to document her journey, to capture every moment of pain and joy, every small victory over the forces that sought to silence her, so that when her time came, the world might remember that Lily had lived not in fear but in bold, beautiful defiance, and that in the face of a relentless, segregated society, she had chosen to create her own legacy of resilience and love, a legacy that would live on in the hearts of those who dared to dream of a better tomorrow. And as the night wore on, and the distant sound of Samuel's laughter faded into the background, the pages of her journal filled with her voice, she understood that while her body might eventually succumb to the ravages of illness, her spirit would continue to sing, echoing across time as a testament to the power of hope, the strength of the human heart, and the enduring promise that even in the darkest moments, there is beauty, there is love, and there is a future waiting to be claimed. Lily's hand trembled slightly as she pressed the pen to the paper, each stroke of ink carving out fragments of her soul, weaving together the pieces of a life that had been defined by struggle but also by love, by defiance, by moments of quiet resilience that no one had ever truly seen, and perhaps that was what hurt the most, that her life had been lived in the shadows of history, that her story, like so many others, had been swept aside, dismissed, ignored by a world too blind to see the beauty in the voices it had silenced. But now, as her time waned, she would not let herself disappear without a trace, without leaving behind something real, something that could not be erased, something that would remind Samuel and Ruth, and perhaps even the world beyond their small town, that she had been here, that she had mattered, that she had lived and loved and fought against the chains that sought to hold her down. And as she wrote, her thoughts drifted back to the past, to the girl she had once been, wide-eyed and full of dreams, believing that love could transcend color, that kindness could melt hatred, that she could one day walk into a room and be seen for the woman she was rather than the limits society placed upon her. But reality had not been so kind, and she had learned too soon that love, no matter how pure, could be torn apart by the cruelty of men who wielded power like a weapon, who sought to control even the most private corners of the heart. And she had watched as the man she had loved, a man with soft hands and eyes full of promises, had been dragged from her arms, his face bloodied, his voice strangled by the noose of white supremacy, and she had known then that no matter how much she yearned, no matter how much she fought, the world would never be ready for a love like theirs, and so she had buried that part of herself, had stitched the pain into the fabric of her dresses, had swallowed the grief with every polite smile, had moved through life as a ghost of who she once was, until the years had blurred together, and all that remained was the weight of what had been lost. But now that death was creeping ever closer, now that her body was failing her, she could not allow that love, that pain, that truth, to remain hidden. And so she wrote with a feverish urgency, each word an act of rebellion, each sentence a refusal to be erased, until the ink smudged beneath her fingertips, and the candle beside her burned low, its flickering light casting shadows against the walls, dancing with the ghosts of her past. And in that quiet, in that stillness, she felt a presence, a whisper of something beyond this world, and she did not know if it was the sickness overtaking her, or the exhaustion pressing against her ribs, or if perhaps, just perhaps, it was him, the man she had lost, watching over her now, waiting for her on the other side. And the thought made her heart ache in a way that had nothing to do with illness, because she had spent so long convincing herself that love was a luxury she could no longer afford, that dreams were for other people, that her life, for all its hardships, had not been a tragedy but simply a reality she had learned to endure. But now, as she traced her fingers over the pages of her journal, as she listened to the sounds of the house around her, Ruth's careful footsteps, Samuel's quiet breathing as he slept, she realized that even in all the pain, even in all the loss, there had still been something beautiful, something worth holding on to, and she would not let it slip away. So she turned to the next page, her hands shaking but determined, and she wrote the words she had never been able to say aloud, the confession that had burned inside her for decades. And when she finished, she closed the journal, pressing it to her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps, the weight of the years pressing down upon her. But she was not afraid. Not anymore, because she had told her story. She had spoken her truth, and even if no one else ever read these pages, even if they were lost to time, she knew that she had not lived in vain, that somewhere, somehow, the echoes of her voice would carry on. And as the first rays of morning light crept through the window, painting the walls in gold, she allowed her eyes to close, allowed the past and present to blur together, and in the silence, in the stillness, she smiled. Because for the first time in a long time, she felt free. Lily's breathing slowed as the morning light painted the walls, her fingers still clutching the journal to her chest, her heartbeat steady but growing faint, the weight of her memories pressing down on her like a quilt stitched together with sorrow and love, regrets and victories, moments of defiance and years of endurance. But as her body weakened, her spirit remained strong, defiant, unwilling to let go just yet, because she still had something left to do, still had one more act of rebellion left in her before the sickness could claim her completely. And so with every ounce of strength left in her, she forced herself to sit up, the effort making her dizzy, the room tilting slightly. But she refused to surrender to the weakness, she refused to let the past be buried with her, because if she had learned anything in her 35 years, it was that silence was the greatest weapon of those who wished to erase history. And she would not let them erase hers, not when she had fought so hard, loved so fiercely, suffered so deeply. So she pulled herself up, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her hands gripping the edge of the table as she steadied herself, and then, with trembling fingers, she reached for the small wooden box she had kept hidden in the back of the cupboard for years, dust gathering on its surface, its contents untouched, unseen, but never forgotten. And as she pried it open, the creak of the wood filling the quiet room, her eyes fell upon the collection of letters, photographs, scraps of memories that she had tucked away long ago, unable to face them, unwilling to let them go. And there, beneath it all, lay the photograph that had haunted her for years, the edges frayed, the surface worn from being held too many times, and in it, she saw herself, younger, full of dreams, standing beside him, the man who had once been her world, his dark eyes filled with a love that had been as fierce as it was doomed. And looking at it now, at the image of the girl she had once been, she felt something stir inside her, something she had thought lost to time, a defiance, a fire, a need to be remembered. And she knew what she had to do. She had to tell the truth, she had to let the world know what had been stolen from her, from him, from all of them. So she gathered the letters, the photographs, the journal, clutching them to her chest as she made her way to the door, her legs weak beneath her, but her determination stronger than ever, because this was her story, this was her life, and even if the world had tried to silence her, she would not let them win. So she stepped out into the morning light, the town already stirring to life, the scent of fresh bread from the bakery mixing with the distant sound of a radio playing jazz, and she walked, each step heavier than the last, each breath a struggle. But she did not stop. She would not stop. Not until she reached the place where she could finally be heard, where she could finally be seen. And as she approached the town square, where the newspaper office stood, where the voices of the past had been buried beneath headlines that ignored the truth, she pushed open the door, the bell above jingling softly, the clerk looking up, startled to see her there, this woman who had been invisible to them for so long. And she walked forward, placing the journal, the letters, the photographs on the counter, her hands steady, her voice firm as she said, "I have a story to tell." And for the first time in her life, she saw recognition in the eyes of the man before her, saw the weight of her words settle over him, and she knew, in that moment, that she had won, that her story would not die with her, that she had carved her name into history. And as she turned to leave, the sunlight streaming through the window casting her in a golden glow, she smiled, Because she had done what she had set out to do, she had refused to be forgotten. And as she stepped back into the world, her body aching, her heart full, she knew that no matter what came next, no matter how much time she had left, she had already found her peace, because she had finally been heard. Lily's feet dragged through the dusty streets, the soft scuff of her shoes barely audible over the hum of the town that was beginning to wake. The sun had barely risen, but the heat of the day already pressed on her skin like a heavy hand, and she welcomed it, welcomed the burn that reminded her she was still alive, still fighting, still clinging to a world that had often tried to break her. She could feel the journal, the letters, the photographs, pressing against her chest like a weight she had carried for years, a burden now transformed into a weapon, a shield, a voice that was finally demanding to be heard. She could smell the faint scent of lilacs from the small flower shop down the street, the soft fragrance of brief, fleeting comfort, but the comfort was fleeting, as all comforts had been, and as her steps carried her farther from the shadows of her home, the air seemed to grow thicker, heavier, suffocating her with the weight of what she had done, what she had come here to do, but she would not turn back, not now. The past few weeks had been a blur, a haze of moments that slipped through her fingers as the illness took hold, as the breath in her chest became more labored, as the weight of the world seemed to press against her from all sides. But there had also been clarity, moments of sharp understanding that cut through the fog like the edge of a blade. There had been no time to waste. The sickness was progressing faster than they had anticipated, and though her mind was sharp, her body was weakening, her strength was slipping through her hands like sand. She thought of her mother, how she had carried the weight of her family's legacy on her shoulders, how she had quietly endured every slight, every insult, every quiet moment of pain that no one ever saw, and how, in the end, it had been those same quiet moments of endurance that had been her undoing, and Lily had vowed, long ago, that she would not go quietly, that her story would not end with a whisper. She had never been one to demand attention. Her entire life had been lived in the margins, unnoticed and unremarkable to those who didn't see the beauty in a woman who didn't fit their mold, who didn't fit the narrow expectations of beauty, of dignity, of worth that society tried to impose on people like her. She had been quiet, reserved, but she had never been invisible, not truly. She had fought for every scrap of respect, every inch of recognition she had ever received, even if it meant putting aside her own desires to care for others, to fill the roles that were expected of her. She had spent years in the kitchen of the local diner, washing dishes, serving food, smiling through the insults, the laughter behind her back, the way the customers would glance at her with pity in their eyes, as if she were something to be looked at, something to be mocked. And there had been the others, the ones in the black community who saw her body as a thing to be ashamed of, who whispered behind her back, who looked away when she walked into a room, and in her quiet moments, she had wondered if she was doomed to live forever in that place of loneliness, of being neither truly accepted by one world nor truly understood by the other. But then came that day, the day she walked into the tiny jazz club after hours, when the music had stopped and the place was nearly empty, save for a few scattered regulars, when the scent of whiskey and stale cigarettes still lingered in the air, and there he had been, the man who had changed everything for her. Ezra. His eyes had locked onto hers across the room, dark and intense, and for the first time in a long while, she had felt seen, really seen, as if the world could hold her and not demand that she shrink. Ezra had been a musician, a piano player whose fingers could coax the most beautiful sounds from an old, scarred instrument. His music had a depth to it, a rawness that spoke to her soul, and when he played, it was as if the world around them disappeared, leaving only the two of them, tethered by something far stronger than either of them could have understood. He was tall, handsome in a way that made people stop and take notice, but it wasn't just his looks that had captivated her. It was the way he moved through the world, the way he refused to accept the status quo, the way his words were as sharp as his music, and yet, beneath it all, there was a vulnerability that resonated with her in a way that nothing else ever had. She had spent years denying herself the right to feel wanted, to feel desired, and yet here, in this small, dimly lit room, Ezra had made her feel like she mattered, like her body, her presence, her very soul had value, and as they had talked, the hours slipping by unnoticed, something inside her had shifted, and she had found the courage to say the things she had never allowed herself to say. They had danced together that night. The soft, swaying movement of their bodies, an unspoken conversation, an affirmation that they both longed for something more, something deeper than the world had allowed them to have. They both knew the risks of what they were doing, knew the danger that came with even the smallest act of defiance in a world that had been built on segregation, on the idea that certain people were meant to stay apart, but there was something between them, something undeniable, and for the first time in her life, Lily had felt the weight of the world shift in her favor, even if only for that brief moment. As the days went by, their bond deepened, quiet moments stolen between her shifts, between his performances, and each time their hands touched, a spark would ignite within her, a spark she had long since buried beneath layers of doubt and fear. But she wasn't foolish enough to believe it could last. She knew the world would never accept them, that society would never allow their love to survive without tearing them apart, but for the first time in a long time, Lily found herself daring to dream of a life beyond the pain, beyond the hurt, a life where she was free to love without fear, where she could hold Ezra without worrying about who was watching. And then came the moment, the phone call that would change everything, the moment when her doctor had given her the diagnosis that would erase everything, terminal cancer. She had always known something wasn't right, had felt the fatigue in her bones, the tightness in her chest, but to hear the words spoken aloud, to know that time had been stolen from her, was a blow that took her breath away, and in that moment, she was overwhelmed by a sadness she couldn't explain, by the knowledge that her time was running out. The news had cast a shadow over everything. How could she dare to love, to dream, to fight for a future when she was so close to losing everything? But the thought of leaving without having fully lived, without having fully loved, was more terrifying than the illness itself, and so Lily decided to spend her remaining days not in quiet resignation, but in the kind of defiance she had never allowed herself before. The fear of her own mortality became the fuel for her courage, and she vowed to leave behind something lasting, something meaningful. It would be a legacy that was more than just survival, more than just enduring. It would be a statement of the power of love, of strength, of a woman who refused to be hidden. Lily's journey from there would be difficult, filled with moments of intense pain, but in those final days, she would discover that there was more to life than what the world had told her, that the quiet acts of defiance, the courage to love, the will to be heard, would be the things that truly defined her, and when she finally left this world, it would be with the knowledge that she had lived and loved in the way that she had always deserved. But the fight, her fight, was far from over. Lily stood in front of the cracked mirror in the small room she had rented for the night, the faint glow of the streetlights spilling across the floor in pale ribbons, the soft hum of the world outside, somehow a world apart from the pain that racked her body. She had always been a woman of quiet strength, one who carried the burdens of others with grace and composure, but today, in the face of her own mortality, she felt the weight of a lifetime's worth of invisible scars, and she could feel the sharpness of each breath, the ache in her bones, a reminder that time was slipping away like the last whispers of a song she would never finish. But Lily had made her peace with it. She had long known that there was a deeper fight, one she had never fully understood until now, that the fight was not just for herself but for those who came after her, for the generations that would come to know her story through the courage she had found in her final days. The illness had ravaged her body, taken the vibrancy from her once strong frame, but it had never touched her soul, never dimmed the fire within her that burned brightly against a world that had long tried to snuff it out. There were days when she wanted to give in, when she wanted to surrender to the pull of darkness, to let it take her quietly, without a fuss, without resistance. But those were the days when she thought of Ezra, of their stolen moments in the jazz club, of the way he had held her hand when the world seemed to turn its back on them, of the way his music had spoken to something deep inside her, something primal and alive. She thought of the letters she had written, the ones that told a story no one had ever bothered to listen to, the ones that spoke of love and loss, of dreams deferred, of the quiet dignity of a woman who refused to be silenced, even when the world shouted at her to fade into the background. She had once thought her body a prison, something to be ashamed of, but now, in her final moments, she understood that it had been her greatest strength, the very thing that had defined her resilience. She had not been defeated, not by her illness, not by the world that had told her she was not enough. No, she had fought every inch of the way, and she had loved in a world that had denied her the right to do so. Her love for Ezra had been the most beautiful thing to happen to her, the most pure, the most real, and in the face of everything that tried to tear them apart, she had held on to it with a ferocity that no disease could take from her. The memories of their time together, of their conversations, of their moments of quiet connection, filled her thoughts as she took one last look at the woman in the mirror, the woman who had lived, who had loved, who had fought. She had come so far, further than anyone ever expected, and now, in the solitude of the night, she felt a peace she hadn't thought possible. She wasn't afraid anymore. The door creaked open behind her, and she didn't have to turn to know who it was. Ezra's presence filled the room, a quiet strength, a steady reassurance. "Lily," he whispered, his voice rough, as if he too had been fighting his own battles. She smiled softly, feeling the warmth of his touch on her shoulder, his fingers brushing against her skin like a reminder that she was not alone. He had been her strength, her anchor, the one person who had never wavered, who had never turned his back on her. He had loved her when she had been unlovable, when she had been too heavy, too loud, too much. And now, when the end was near, he was still there, still holding her in a world that had so often tried to cast her aside. "I'm here," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here, Lily. You don't have to be afraid. You fought so hard, and I'm proud of you." His words were soft, tender, and in that moment, she felt her heart swell with a love so deep, so pure, that it nearly took her breath away. He didn't know, couldn't know, how much his presence had meant to her, how his love had been the balm for all the wounds the world had inflicted on her. She hadn't been able to give him everything she had wanted to, not in the time they had, but she had given him all of herself, and in return, he had given her the courage to face this final chapter with grace. Lily took his hand in hers, feeling the roughness of his palm against her own, the calluses from years of hard work, and for a moment, the weight of everything that had passed, everything that had led her here, seemed to lift. She was not alone. She had never been alone. "I love you, Ezra," she said softly, her voice breaking with the emotion she had long held inside. "I've always loved you." He squeezed her hand, and she could feel the truth of his love in the touch, in the way his eyes met hers, with a tenderness that no words could capture. "And I've always loved you, Lily," he whispered, his voice steady, despite the tears that filled his eyes. "You've taught me more about strength and love than I ever thought possible." She smiled through the tears, her heart full, and in that moment, she realized that this love they shared, was enough. It was enough to sustain her in these final moments, enough to leave behind a legacy that no illness, no injustice, no hatred could ever erase. The world might never know the full story of Lily, the woman who had defied every expectation, but it didn't matter. She knew. And Ezra knew. And that was enough. As the night wore on, Lily let herself be held, let herself surrender to the love and peace she had fought so hard for. The pain of the illness ebbed, and she was no longer afraid of what was coming. She had lived, and in her living, she had found a truth far more important than survival, that love, in all its forms, was worth fighting for. And so, when the time came, as the world outside carried on, unaware of the quiet triumph of a woman who had chosen to live and love fully, Lily's spirit slipped away, free from the chains of fear, free from the weight of the world's expectations, and in that moment, she was more than enough. She was whole. And though her story had ended, her legacy, her love, would echo through the hearts of those who had known her, who had been touched by her forever. If you found this story moving and want to see more gripping, emotional tales, Don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on the latest content. Your support means the world, and it helps us bring more stories to life. Thank you for being part of this journey.